And so I'm not going to read Ross's bio, which is long and full of amazing accomplishments, including the fact that you're now a professor emeritus, which is sort of what we're all striving for, which I think means that you get to do only the things that are fun and interesting. You have, so Ross Baldick has done a lot of work in the optimization field. He knows all about markets. And I think what I admire most, what I want to sort of highlight, is his work as an educator, not just in the academic setting, but also sort of in the spirit of public service. For example, there is an email list, the Power Globe list, on which people from all over the world ask questions, sometimes sophisticated, sometimes less so. And Ross is one of the people who always responds in a really sincere and educated and also polite way to sort of help elevate everyone's understanding of the issues. So I just, really appreciate that. And I think, Ross, you have a lot of online fans, more than you're aware of. So I would introduce him as an educator and a gentleman, and it's so great to have you here to do this presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. That's very, very kind of you. As a tip for young players, never send the first draft of the email. That's the and remove most of the expletives, right? Unless you really need them in the expression. So I'm delighted today to present at my alma mater on Texas extreme weather. I've lived in Texas for several decades, and the last really, really cold time was 1989, which was a few years before I came to Texas. I have gone through some cold times in Texas, but I think it's fair to say that this event in February 2021 was extreme weather and had extreme implications that ranged, across all areas of life. But I want to talk predominantly about electricity. So to understand it, we of course have to understand the electricity implications. We have to understand the weather context and how electric demand is affected by low temperature. I'll give a little bit of the timeline leading up to and during the rolling blackouts. Most of this information is derived from public information. We'll turn to the reasons for the outages and blackouts. There is still limited information about many of those details. And so some of the things I'm going to say, I privately know a little bit more, but I'm not sure that there's public information that supports that. So I'll stay away from anything that's not publicly information. It also had implications for wholesale market prices. A California company called Griddy, which sells electricity in Texas, had an exciting couple of weeks, or perhaps more to the point, their customers did. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I think I want to make a connection to other regions. And before the recording started, I mentioned that I grew up in Australia. So there'll be some connection to Australia, but also to California. And I think this is something that's particularly relevant given the summer fires in California in the last year. So what's the weather context? Well, I think, when I was a Berkeley student, I guess I traveled through Texas at one time, but I didn't have much of a clue about Texas. But what I knew about Texas was that it was hot, right? And I'm sure all of us knows that Texas is hot. And there are many days every year that are above 100 Fahrenheit or 38 Celsius. And, my joke about Berkeley is that if the temperature gets as hot as 75, all the environmentalists and greenies go out and drive around in their Priuses with the air conditioning because of the outrageous temperature. Well, we get many days every year above 100. And that's just a typical hot summer. Sometimes we have extremely hot summers, which means many tens of consecutive days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really hard to take, I have to say. There's been summers where there's been over 50 days total above 100 Fahrenheit, which is really hard to take. And the highest temperature ever was about 120 Fahrenheit. So is anybody out there a Midnight Oil aficionado? Does anybody know Midnight Oil, the Australian band? Well, they have a lyric in a song that says the Western desert lives and breathes at 45 degrees, right? So they thought that 45 degrees Celsius was unintelligibly hot, right? Well, Texas beats that by 4 Celsius, by 8 or 9 Fahrenheit. And furthermore, not only is it hot, perhaps bizarrely, Texas has significant population growth. We've had close to 2% each year in the last decade or so. So what does that mean? It's really hot and there's lots of people coming here. So what would you expect? Energy over the year, particularly electricity, and peak consumption, peak megawatts or gigawatts should grow, even if we're improving our energy efficiency, right? Now, as Carl, who's in the audience, will point out, California's been much more committed to energy efficiency than Texas, but even not working hard, it's pretty easy to be more energy efficient today than 10 years ago, right? So particularly if you're building new houses, have new housing stock, it's reasonable that the peak demand and indeed the energy would be growing with the population, but will grow a bit slower, right? So the peak demand's been growing about 1% per annum. And that is the summer peak demand, which is typically our peak. It's now around about 75 gigawatts. So most planning for extremes, we plan for summer peak conditions. That's really the time of greatest concern. And I'm going to focus specifically on the part of Texas that is the separate interconnection called the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. Most of the planning in ERCOT focuses on summer. And until this year, we've always been summer peaking. And it's fair to say that capacity has been tight in some summers. And you might say that the generation fleet is well summarized. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's well weatherized for the summer, okay? So that's summer with an ER, not summarized as you might summarize this presentation, right? But having said that, it's also cold occasionally in Texas. And I checked with the National Weather Service, and for a bunch of years, I've got them there in the presentation, and I think we'll be sharing this presentation later, so I'm not going to go through the specific years. All of those years set low temperature records, cold records in Texas cities. And the coldest ever temperature was minus 23 Fahrenheit or minus 30 Celsius. This is a pretty big range, right? That's 80 Celsius degrees range from hottest to coldest. Now, our most recent storm was reported by some newspapers. I not really sure on what basis they reported that, but they reported that it was the third worst ever, behind the 1989 and the 1899 winters. And I think this was because of its extent physically and also its duration. If you top those years up and divide by the number of years, extreme cold has been about a once a decade phenomenon since 1899. So I'm not disputing that climate change may be changing this, but the reality is we've had it about once a decade since 1899. Well, our last big cold was 2011, and there was blackouts, forced outages, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is a federal regulator, the North American Reliability Corporation, which is responsible for reliability issues in North America, investigated the blackouts and had a bunch of recommendations, many of them around weatherization, okay, for cold. This was another cold event. They weren't made mandatory. So the Public Utility Commission, the local regulator here in California, it's the California Public Utility Commission. Here in Texas, it's the Public Utility Commission of Texas, did not decide to make those recommendations mandatory. But it seems some generation asset owners did do weatherization, and the recommendations spanned across gas, electric, and water infrastructure. But it's fair to say that all of those regions are not as well weatherized for what are once a decade events. So we could say they're not as well winterized as they are summerized. Okay, so what happens when we get low temperature? Well, I think it's probably pretty obvious to everybody in the audience here that heaters start running, particularly residential heating, let's say. So you might have a gas-fired furnace blower. If you have a gas-fired furnace, but it's forced air, that would need some electricity to run, maybe less than a kilowatt. You might have a heat pump that might be several kilowatts, or you might have resistive heating, which would be maybe over 10 kilowatts. That power level is going to be consumed when it's on, right? And when it's off, it maybe is consuming zero, or you might have some more sophisticated power electronics, but we could more or less say that the duty cycle is going to increase as the temperature drops, and obviously the average energy is going to increase. Well, here's the rub. I have a heat pump at my house, nice efficient idea, okay? Heat pump takes heat from the external environment and brings it into your house to heat your house. It's the opposite of an air conditioner. In fact, it's often called a reverse cycle air conditioner. Unfortunately, when it gets really cold outside, heat pumps become less efficient. This is due to the Carnot efficiency, but I think there are a few other things that also limit it in practice with commercial models. And what happens? They switch to resistive heating. They typically have a bunch of resistors on them that is interposed in the airstream, and they become big resistive heaters. So whether you started with resistive heating or you had a heat pump, if it gets really cold, it's all going to turn to resistive heating, which is all going to be used more because it's colder, right? Okay, so there's been a lot of new housing in Texas in recent years. Unlike Berkeley, where you can't build anything, right? Okay, it's banana land, right? Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, right? Or maybe it's nope land, not on planet Earth, right? For those of you who are homeowners in Berkeley, I'm sure you appreciate that. In Texas, well, we got a lot of land and there's been a lot of new housing stock. And you might expect that the insulation and thermal performance would be better than in old houses. Maybe not better than in this old houses, for those of you who have time to watch television, but better than in typical old houses. But anecdotally, a lot of the heating appears to be electric, not clear whether it's heat pumps or resistive. But even if it's heat pumps, it's going to turn to resistors when it gets really cold. And it may be the case that the construction is not well insulated. Although, let me say to everybody in the audience, anybody who doesn't have a well-insulated house in Texas is crazy, right? Because it's so hot that you just make life really unpleasant for yourself. Well, combination of widespread cold, electric heating, including heat pumps, switching to resistive, meant that we had record electric demand. So prior to 2021, and this is a repeated theme, summer was the most significant electricity demand. Prior to 2021, winter peak was always lower than the summer peak. Some other regions, colder regions of the world and of the country, have winter peaks that are higher than summer, but we in Texas have higher summer peaks. Summer peaks have been more than 70 gigawatts since 2015. Does anybody know what the California peak is? Okay, someone can look that up and tell us. And you need to divide by the California population and divide by the Texas population to make it a reasonable comparison. What you'll find is there's California peak demand is lower than Texas, but there's more people in California than in Texas. So we consume a lot more power, predominantly because of we consume more energy, and our peaks are higher, predominantly because of air conditioning. So the summer peaks have been bigger than 70 gigawatts since 2015, and now they're about 75. The winter peaks are more variable. This picture shows the winter peaks, and they're in the blue bars. And you can see the top of my graph here is 70 gigawatts. And in 2015, it was only about 57, 58. 2018 was about 66. And the peak demand actually served in February was 69 gigawatts, the height of this blue bar. What does this red bar reflect? This is what the peak demand would have been had we not got into rolling blackouts. And as you can see from my picture, the winter peak demand here is literally off the chart, right? It's literally off the chart. Looks like Daniel Chow raised a hand. Daniel, do you want to ask a question?
Were you able to like see the 2011 winter peak? Because that was the last time.
Yeah, good. That's a great question. I got this data from the ERCOT Market Monitor, and I just sort of asked her a vague question about what the peaks were. And it's a great question. I haven't gone back to 2011. I don't believe it was above 60 gigawatts. Okay, that's my understanding. It was high, but I don't think it was above what we've seen more recently. Okay, it was quite high, but the prior to this year, I know that the biggest peak was 66 gigawatts in 2018. So I don't know, as a matter of fact, what 2011 was, but I do know that it was no higher than the 2018 peak. Okay, but it was probably higher than the surrounding years. Winter peaks are more variable, right? We have relentlessly hot summers. We have pretty mild winters, but occasionally extreme cold. So, you know, it's more variable. And that's reflective of that once a decade extreme cold observation, right? So let's think about the lead up. So the timeline. We knew it was going to be cold. February 8th, there was ERCOT system operator was anticipating it was going to be cold. Weather forecast said it was going to be cold. Weather forecasts in a lot of places said it was going to be cold. February 11th, they knew it was going to be a winter record. Going into February 14, which was, I think, the Sunday or so, there had already been forced outages. We have about 107 gigawatts of nameplate capacity in ERCOT. 25 of that is wind, and we didn't expect the wind to be generating much in the winter anyway. Some of that is coal, and our coal plants, our older coal plants, are only switched on in the summer to meet what is typically the summer peak. So they're called seasonal peakers, and they're switched off in the winter, and they're hard to get running. So there really would not have been 107 available, but that was the nameplate. But of what was available, there was 20 gigawatts of forced outages. And that's quite a lot of forced outages to have simultaneously. February 14th, there was a public appeal to conserve. There was a concern about the natural gas supply. Why would that be a particular concern? We have a lot of gas-fired generation in Texas. In fact, it's about 50% of our total capacity, not quite 50% of our energy, but 50% of our total capacity. So gas is a big issue. Then what happened was it kept getting colder and colder and colder on the 14th, and I was really cold. We hit a 69 gigawatt peak. This blue trace is the actual served demand. It doesn't quite correspond to 69 on this chart. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but the recorded peak was around about, the recorded record peak was around 69 gigawatts. Very early morning on Monday, the 15th, rolling blackouts were called. And the reason for that was that there were additional generators that failed. Okay, so at about 1:30 a.m. on the Monday, blackout. Okay, and I woke up because blacked out. So our record peak was 69 gigawatts, which was, as I observed, 3 gigawatts more than the previous record. This dash curve shows an estimate of what it would have been had there not been curtailments. And the uncurtailed peak would have been about 75 gigawatts. That's as much as our summer peak, right? So that's just how extremely strange it is, right? Historically, even in really cold years, our winter peaks have been smaller than the summer peaks, but the uncurtailed peak this time would have matched roughly what our summer peak was, okay? And so the difference between these curves is the rolling blackouts. And what you can see, there was rolling blackouts all day Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then it was restored Wednesday night to basically everybody. I was restored Wednesday afternoon, about 1:30 p.m. as it happens. blackouts, okay? So there had been forced outages of thermal generation, a little bit less wind production than expected. There was a bit of ice on the turbines, but winter's not a very windy time for Texas. We have more wind in spring and fall. The least wind is in the summer, but winter is not particularly windy. We had these additional outages, the rolling blackouts began. Apparently, there was such significant blackouts that the frequency fell by so much that the under frequency tripping of the nukes would have happened had they not called rolling blackouts. So it was very close to a cascade, right? Okay. As I mentioned, the uncurtailed would have been about 75 gigawatts, which would be a 4% growth rate from 2018, from the previous peak, a really huge growth rate. There are about 35 gigs of forced outages. These numbers are a bit squishy, okay? About 35 gigawatts of forced outages and D rates, meaning wind being less than expected, out of 107, and about 20 gigawatts of load shed. So even though there was 35 gigawatts of outages, we certainly didn't have to curtail 35 gigawatts, but 35 gigawatts of outages is so much that we ended up having to curtail 20 gigawatts. Who were the problems? Well, everybody. Nuclear went out, one nuclear plant went out because its feed water froze.
Ross,
there was gas units. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to understand the math on the prior slide there.
Yep.
So you had 107 gigawatts nameplate minus a 35.
So bear in mind that of that 107, some of it is capacity that is not available during the winter anyway. Okay. And the 35 is a bit squishy. Okay. I've heard numbers rather higher than that. So I agree with you. The math is a bit funny, but the main point I wanted to make was there's been some accusations that ERCOT doesn't carry reserves or something like that. It does. In fact, even with 35 gigawatts of outages or more, we only, compared to what we expected, there was 20 gigawatts of load shed thereabouts. Even the 20 gigawatts is a bit squishy, okay? So, but the salient point there is, of course, ERCOT carries reserves just like everybody else. So a 1 gigawatt outage would not have resulted in any need for blackouts. A 2 gigawatt outage would not have resulted in the need for any blackouts. Perhaps even a 15 gigawatts of outage would not have resulted in any load shed or curtailments, but we had 35 gigawatts, right? A really extreme circumstance. Was that responsive to your question? And bear in mind that all of these numbers, I've gleaned them from various reports, and some of them are slightly inconsistent with each other. So that's why I say the numbers are a bit squishy, right? I think they're...
The point is clear, yeah.
Okay, good, super, okay. So all the generators had outages. Some people have said, well, why didn't ERCOT, join with the rest of the world and like California, suck in energy when it needs it? Well, indeed, we have about a gigawatt of import capacity on asynchronous or DC ties. And as it happens, most of the US, maybe not California, maybe not Berkeley, experienced cold weather and high demand. And in fact, even the surrounding regions surrounding ERCOT had rolling blackouts. So those regions had rolling blackouts, meaning they were unable to supply load in those regions. So they weren't exactly going to be selling energy to ERCOT, right? Okay. So in fact, imports to ERCOT reduced during much of the rolling blackouts. So connecting us more strongly to the rest of the world would not necessarily have done much good. We could have had 20 gigawatts of import capacity on additional ties, but unless there was an ability to get energy down to the vicinity of ERCOT, it would not have really helped us, okay? So how are rolling blackouts, how do we choose how to do them? Well, in ERCOT, and this may not be exactly the same as everywhere else, but there are distribution feeders with so-called under frequency load shed relays. What does that do? If the frequency drops and we get into a situation where the nuclear plants are going to trip off because of under frequency, there are 25% of the feeders in ERCOT are set up to trip off the load before the nuke will trip off. The purpose of that is to forestall a cascade and forestall a complete system blackout if there were multiple uncontrolled generator outages. So you're not allowed to outage them deliberately because they're there as the last backstop, okay? There are feeders with critical loads such as hospitals. And if you happen to live on a street where the power was fed from the same feeder as a hospital, then you're also not going to be tripped off, okay? That makes up together in places like Austin, where I live, maybe as much as 45 or 50% of the total load. But the load shed was so large that many distribution feeders were outaged almost continuously for several days. So for me, my home was blacked out for all but 90 minutes over 59 hours, okay? Which was pretty unpleasant. My internal house temperature went down to 43. Outside was at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, talking now. So that was pretty chilly, I have to say, and unpleasant, really unpleasant. So what caused all this? Well, it's really obvious. It was the cold, right? That's we might say, a common mode cause of both the high demand and the failures, right? And it was not only inconvenient to me, but you know, that was pretty temporary. It caused a number of deaths, directly and indirectly due to the cold. So directly, some people literally froze. Indirectly, if you're had some life support equipment and it wasn't on a feeder that was designated as an essential service or not to be outaged, you might have been outaged and you might have had health problems or complications leading to death. So although I was somewhat facetiously saying extreme cold was the reason, it's really, there's multiple interacting issues. Okay. So for example, although this is not a big part of the whole story, there are some gas compressors that push the natural gas along that are electrically powered. The owners of those had not nominated them as critical infrastructure to the transmission and distribution company that was supplying them. And so some of those compressors were interrupted. That meant the gas wasn't being pushed along, and that meant there was less gas. That meant gas supplying the electric generator at the other end was not getting its gas, and that may have reduced its ability to generate, okay? So I don't think that was the lion's share of things, but that's an example of interacting issues, okay? And at least as of today, the relative significance of various specific issues are not clear, although if I can venture something that's a little bit speculative at this point, it seems that the natural gas system was a very major cause, not just because of the interruption of the electrically supplied compressors, but because it appears that gas supply really may have been the most important underlying reason for our blackouts. That's a little speculative. We don't have that information publicly fully yet, but that's what it's shaping up to be, right? That's not to say there weren't other problems. There was definitely less wind than expected, but there was less thermal generation than expected. But some of the thermal generation was not available because of gas limitations.
Ross, what were the other causes of gas supply shortage other than the compressors not being powered?
That's a good question. Let me make observations here on this page. There were a bunch of components that failed in the 2011 cold, extreme cold. Some of them were sensors. So one that comes to mind, on a steam turbine, there's a thing called a drum level sensor, which senses the level of water in the steam drum. That got cold, it didn't, it failed, and that caused a trip of a generator, okay? Those issues were included in the 2011 report, but as a matter of public record, we don't know what fraction of electric generation and gas supply implemented the 2011 recommendations. And we also don't know publicly whether the stuff that broke in 2011 was the same stuff that broke this time. We know that sensors and other stuff that was not sufficiently winterized got cold and failed. but we don't know whether it's the same stuff, okay? And we don't know whether the failures of the generators or failures to the gas infrastructure was more significant. We don't know that for a fact, but I think that the evidence is starting to tend towards the gas infrastructure, okay? So there's a whole bunch of things that can break on a generator. For those of you who are interested in electricity, someday you should take a trip to a generation station. You may not want to work there forever, but having a look at it, you get to feel for the complexity, the mechanical complexity of it, right? So there's all sorts of things that if they fail can cause a trip of the system. Now we might want to have backups for things that can fail, fair enough. But if you have a common mode reason for failure, namely cold, affecting, you know, let's say you've got 3 copies of a sensor because you're afraid of it failing. If all of them are susceptible to cold, right, you really have a common mode failure due to cold. So I'm just giving that as an example. We need to do some forensics on this, just as there were forensics in 2011. My most recent blog post is entitled, "Let's Not Ready, Fire, Aim." So again, to answer, you know, that question, we don't know yet which specific equipment failed, and so therefore we don't know whether it's the same old, and therefore we should have paid attention to the 2011 report, or in contrast, it might be different equipment, in which case we need to think very carefully, right? Because if we fix the things from 2011, but something new broke now, then we're fighting the last war, right? So that sort of careful forensics needs to be done to really know what we should do, okay? Adam, did you have a question? Adam Oxford.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting talk. I had heard that the electrification of the wellhead facilities in the natural gas system had been a kind of a recent occurrence, and that might have been driven by lower prices, possibly related to deregulation, but don't know what the connection is. Are you familiar with that process? Can you speak to that?
I'm not so sure about the wellhead electrification, but I am aware that historically the gas compressors were typically gas powered, and that more recently, particularly where there's nearby electricity infrastructure, they've moved to electric compressors. So my understanding about that is that it's related to electrical equipment is cheaper, easier to maintain, and so forth. And so if you've got electricity, you do it with electricity. There may be similar issues with the wellhead. I am aware that fracking, for example, typically requires an electricity hookup. So they typically do that electrically. But I'm not sure once you've got it all installed, whether you then continue with the electric supply for the pumping or whether there are alternatives. I just don't know about that. But you can imagine that anything that's electrically operated that is providing the motive power to keep the gas flowing is going to be problematic, right, when we have some blackouts. So we need to think carefully about that, right, and think carefully about it specifically in the context of a common mode failure. Something I'm going to point out in a couple of slides is that as a society, we're probably more risk averse than individual market participants that might make a decision, oh, it looks like electrification makes it cheaper for me to run this plant, right? But it might make it much more susceptible to common mode failures. So that's a theme I'll come back to. Was there another question?
Yeah, hi, Russ. I have a question based on a piece that came out from NARUC's National Regulatory Research Institute. They put out a list of regulatory questions associated with this outage. And part of it was including, obviously their concerns are for market manipulation being one of the questions there. And a sub part of that was the idea of passive manipulation or passive withholding. The idea that maybe a sophisticated generation entity would only weatherize part of their fleet in the effort to raise prices. Is that something I don't even know how you examine something like that. I'm kind of curious your thoughts.
My first reaction and this is a little bit gut level, is I'm sure there are much easier ways to jack up the price than do that. So I'd be a little skeptical, but you know, unless they've got specific evidence or that they can point to a specific anecdote. You know, there are stories from the Enron days, right, in the California crisis, of plant owners taking spare parts and burying them so that their generators failed, right? You know, I think they could be apocryphal, and I wonder whether this one's apocryphal. I mean, if they've got a specific evidence, you know, that's one thing, but I honestly don't believe any generator was deliberately not trying to generate. Okay, and bear in mind, there's a good reason for that. Most generators are forward contracted. So if you're a generator and you're forward contracted, you don't want to not be generating because you're on the hook to buy back that energy, as we'll get to in a few moments. I'd be skeptical about that. I think it's likely that the gas industry jacked up prices pretty significantly, right? Okay. So to sort of put this together, because we know it's going to be hot, expectations about annual high temperatures, high demand is, you know, obviously sufficient to motivate summerization. Our generation stock basically is always available in the middle of summer. In contrast, I don't think we have done a good job at anticipating winter demand, extremely high winter demand, and moreover, low temperatures, occasional low temperatures, have not been enough to motivate winterization. And something to bear in mind is that summerization and winterization are somewhat antithetical, okay? So in the summer in Texas, I wear shorts and a t-shirt, okay? In the winter in Texas, I wear long pants, at least occasionally, and a sweater and a jacket, right? If you want to winterize, it often means to cover up, right? But if you cover up a generator, it could be too hot in the summer. So these things are somewhat antithetical. So if we're going to try to do both, we need to think about how to make them work together. I don't know enough about this except to observe that they're somewhat antithetical. Let's turn now to prices, and we'll come back to this market manipulation story. ERCOT is kind of unusual in the US. It's an energy and an ancillary services only market. It's similar to the market in Alberta and Canada and to Australia, but it's rather different to other US markets. So new generation, investments in new generation and contracting is because someone expects that occasionally there'll be high prices. They might simulate what the price evolution is going to be over various futures. And if the prices are good enough, they might invest in a generator. Okay. ERCOT also has a short-term forward day-ahead market. That's the same as all other US ISO markets, including CAISO. And I think it's fair to say that this has been sufficient to provide incentives so that we've got good summarization. But I think it's also fair to say that it's not been sufficient for winterization. It's just an apparent empirical fact. We don't have a capacity market in ERCOT, and that's unusual. Other US markets have a capacity market. What does a capacity market do? It makes a prediction. It's typically run by the system operator. The system operator makes a prediction about what peak demand will be 3 years ahead, and it sets up an arrangement where that capacity is arranged to be there in 3 years' time. An alternative is a retailer obligation. Now, retailer obligation is actually what happens in California, for example, but all other US markets either have retailer obligations or a capacity market. And some concern has been leveled that because we failed to have a capacity market, because we failed to have retailer obligations in ERCOT, that that might have been the reason for our problem. Well, I don't think there's actually any evidence of that. I don't think there's any evidence that the capacity market requirements would have anticipated the winter peak, just like no one else anticipated the winter peak. On the other hand, capacity markets are pretty stringent on not being available at the peak. And that motivates, for example, in the Northeast US, firm gas contracts and ability to run off gas and maybe distillate that you might have in a tank. It's not clear to me that that would work for a 3-day event, which is what we had. And here's the rub. A firm gas contract, electric generator might purchase gas on the firm basis. And that means I expect to get the gas except for extreme conditions. Well, it turns out some firm gas was curtailed under a contractual term, force majeure. Force majeure applies typically to acts of God or weather events. So it's not clear that a capacity market would have got us out of the weather, because the problem was not necessarily the lack of generation capacity. In fact, it was not the problem was not the lack of generation capacity. The problem was, to some degree, unavailability of fuel. Even for coal plants, some of the outages were due to frozen coal piles, for example. When we have to curtail, when there's scarcity, the ERCOT wholesale prices are set by what we could call an administrative mechanism, not based on explicit offers or bids, but based on a rule. And that rule is pursuant to a thing called the operating reserve demand curve. And it replaced what was previously in place. Previously in place was, to be explicit, a tolerance of exercise of market power under tight supply. That was called the scarcity pricing mechanism, even though it didn't price scarcity and wasn't a mechanism as defined by an economist. But operating reserve demand curve does actually price scarcity. And the upshot of it is that prices occasionally have risen towards or even to the offer cap. And the offer cap in Texas is very high compared to most other parts of the US. It's $9,000 a megawatt hour. There's, that's sort of the headline, right? There's also a so-called circuit breaker that says, you know what, if a lot of money is transacted in the market, once we hit a threshold, we're going to change the cap. And so long as those prices go to the cap, maybe for an hour here, an hour there, it's all actually pretty fine. It has worked quite well in the past. But I think among other things that were not anticipated, it wasn't anticipated that we'd have extended contiguous periods of prices at the cap. We just didn't contemplate it. But that's what happened. So the prices were $9,000 a megawatt hour for several days straight, which is a lot of money, okay? That's a lot of money. They're at the offer cap for several days. Circuit breaker, it's based on adding up the difference, the margin between the market price as set by this mechanism and the marginal cost of a peaker. And it's by design, the circuit breaker, it says break there, but it should say circuit breaker, lowers the offer cap. And the idea is to avoid huge transfers of wealth. It was triggered, but unfortunately was ineffective. Why was it ineffective? Because the circuit breaker then transitions over to a so-called lower offer cap. Unfortunately, the low offer cap is based on a pretty large multiple of gas prices. And as I said, gas prices were pretty high. And so it turned out that the lower offer cap, you'll see why I put it in quotes, the lower offer cap was actually higher than the high offer cap. So it didn't work, okay? It didn't work. Furthermore, we've got a bit of a problem because the high electricity prices persisted up to the end of the blackouts. And there's some current legislation that's going to possibly force repricing. So there's a lot of things going on. Having said that, not many residential customers are exposed to wholesale prices. There are a few tens of thousands of customers on gritty tariffs. That's that California company that sells, actually sold, should be in past tense because it's gone bankrupt, sold energy in ERCOT based on wholesale real-time prices. There are a couple of other similar real-time wholesale prices, but they only had about 10,000 customers out of 10 million. So even though you might have seen the headline of the grumpy Dallas gritty customer who had a huge bill, did anyone see that? There wasn't too many of him. And to be honest, he consumed so much energy that he was a bit of an outlier anyway. There are, however, many commercial and industrial customers who are at least partly exposed. They have electricity prices that are indexed to gas prices. Who lost money? Well, there were losses incurred by generators with forward positions that had outages or gas supply limitations. That's, by the way, why I'm not so sure that generators would be particularly interested in switching themselves off, because most generators in ERCOT, a lot of their capacity is forward contract. Okay? Even if you didn't have a forward, if you weren't able to generate, you didn't have the opportunity to sell energy at $9,000. So you had a significant opportunity cost. So I think it's quite implausible to imagine that a generator wouldn't want to get themselves online and working given those prices. There was so much curtailment, 20 gigawatts of curtailment, that even bringing a 500 megawatt generator back online would not have moved the curtailment to zero, and therefore would not have changed the price from around 9,000. So I think it's actually implausible that any generator would have wanted to be outaged. You also lost money if you're a retailer and you sold at, let's say, 11 cents a kilowatt hour, $110 a megawatt hour, but you had to buy energy at 9,000, okay? Now, many retailers are hedged, but some of them might not be fully hedged. However, because they were rolling blackouts, less than the normal amount of electricity was being provided anyway. So that may not be too bad for them, for most of them, although at least one retailer has gone bankrupt. And there are some consumers that were not hedged, some commercial industrials, and maybe residentials on griddy. So there's various people who've lost money directly from the electricity problem. Of course, there are other people who lost money because their pipes broke. In other words, indirect issues. Prices continue to be at the offer cap for 2 days after the blackout. I think this is an error in administrative price setting, and there's a current controversy. Several bankruptcies, multiple resignations and firings. There's investigations proceeding at the state level. There are state bills proceeding at the state level. And in Texas currently, we have a separated regulator for gas from the regulator for electricity. Given that gas and electric interact so significantly, I think we need to think about putting them together. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of people unhappy, a lot of state legislators unhappy. I think it'll take quite a few months to really get everything understood and out in the open. But here's where I just want to finish with 1 or 2 slides, and I know I'm running a little over time, and I apologize for anybody who needs to leave. What's the relevance to other regions? Well, it seems that our extreme cold, and more generically the Northern Hemisphere extreme cold, is a jet stream phenomenon. Okay, so anywhere in Northern Hemisphere may experience this at some time. It's less likely and less severe in the Southern Hemisphere. However, the Southern Hemisphere doesn't get off scot-free. There's been recent very heavy rain in Australia that's due to a combination of a La Nina and that should say jet stream. I have a good friend and colleague from Stanford, and I showed him, he was in Sydney when I was there a couple of years ago, and we went to a museum and it talked about El Nino and La Nina, and he looked at me and said, does Australia experience El Nino and La Nina? I'm sure no Berkeley student would need to ask that question, right? It's a phenomenon of the Pacific Ocean, both the West and the Eastern Pacific. So when there's a La Nina and when the jet stream, sorry for the typo, we've had heavy rain. And so those sort of big common mode phenomena can occur basically anywhere. Common mode phenomena are relevant indeed to tight electricity supply conditions everywhere. And so, for example, if we had a combination of very high temperatures, low wind conditions, like last summer in California, but also occurs in Australia, particularly if that happened after sundown, so the solar was not generating and there was no evening breeze, that's a rare phenomenon, but occasionally happens, then we could have very tight supply in California, we could have very tight supply in Australia. In other words, common mode phenomena, not necessarily due to extreme cold, but also potentially due to extreme hot or due to rain, are relevant to problems everywhere. And I just want to quote, impactful weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity and geographical expanse and duration, right? So things are getting more significant. And I observe to you that we as a society probably are more risk averse for these sort of wide scale common mode phenomena than typical market participants. Because of that, we need to think very carefully about regulations and standards that are specifically designed to handle such phenomena. So in electric generation, we have low voltage ride-through requirements that are standards on wind turbines, for example. That's because we don't want a common mode issue such as widespread low voltage to lead to a bunch of outages, right? So common mode phenomena and dealing with them by regulations and standards is something that we shouldn't find too strange. And it's particularly relevant where we as a society are less willing to undertake the risks of, blackouts for 3 days than perhaps market participants are. Furthermore, there's a complication here. To the extent that climate change is changing the incidents, and I'm not entirely clear that cold weather events are changing in incidents because of climate change, but generically, to the extent that the frequency of occurrence of weather events, broadly speaking, are increasing in frequency, we need to pay attention to that and not just base things on historical averages. So to finish, and apologies that I've run a bit over time, we have extreme weather that affected the electric demand and the supply. We had extended blackouts, which I can tell you were extremely unpleasant. Cold was the common mode cause of multiple failures, and common mode causes are definitively relevant to other regions, and we need to think carefully about how we might, as communities, deal with them. Although I am generally a supporter of market solutions, I think these sort of very relatively unusual but high impact events are probably not well handled by any sort of market function, and we need to think sensibly about how to impose regulations and standards to make them work better. So with that, I'd be very happy if there are any further questions or any comments.
Thank you so much, Ross. That was great, really interesting. I propose that we simply go to the questions that have been posted in the chat window.
Okay, I better
while
open it.
others may raise their hand, and you've kindly agreed to stay a few minutes past.
More than
I'm
happy
certainly
to.
happy to stay on.
Super. Okay,
So I think, Keith, yours was first in the queue.
Yeah, so I asked that question and then Ross promptly answered it, basically. But basically it was, how did utilities which shield residential customers from the real-time prices avoid bankruptcy when the real-time prices went very high? And what slide 24 basically demonstrated was that they either had forward contracts or they didn't, and some went bankrupt. So.
Indeed. So it's all a matter of the contracting. There are all sorts of aspects of electricity markets that are outside what we see as run by the ISO. So there's all sorts of forward contracting. There's not only that, there's insurance policies. You can, if you're a generator and you have a contractual obligation to a retailer that has perhaps hedged the retailer, but what happens if the generator fails? Well, a generator can take out, it turns out, forced outage insurance. And there's even a version of forced outage insurance which only pays out if the market price is sufficiently high. So there's all sorts of opportunities along the chain for market participants to hedge their exposure to risks that they perceive as material, right? I think part of the problem is that no one really thought very carefully about an extreme cold weather event as a likely risk, right? So I think it's fair to say that probably we'll find more and more parties who were not perfectly hedged. I mean, there've already been some bankruptcies, but I think we'll see more and more as time goes on.
And is it correct to say some of the headlines where it's like X customer got hit with a $10,000 electricity bill for the week? Was that because they had signed up for the gritty program that explicitly exposed them?
They were a gritty customer. The only ones I'm aware, there's another retailer in Texas called Octopus. It's actually a UK company, but to the best of my knowledge, the only folks that had these huge bills were gritty customers. By the way, Gritty sent texts to all its customers the week before and said, please sign up with another retailer. Please leave us, right?
Yeah.
Griddy said to its customers, please leave us. So the guy that you're probably thinking about, he lives in a Dallas suburb. He lives in a 3-bedroom house, according to the news article. He consumes on a daily basis, according to the information he posted, about a huge multiple of the amount of energy that you and I consume. I am, in fact, not even sure how he could have consumed it unless he was, let's say, a indoor plant farmer with a couple of acres of cannabis plants being illuminated during this time, right? Now, even I let my plants die, right? So I personally don't have much sympathy for this person.
Yeah, it just seems crazy to sign up for that program without having a Nest thermostat or other basically smart home device that says if prices go high, turn everything off. That's basically, should be a requisite for signing up for the program. But
you think so? I think it's fair to say that Griddy had customers who should not have been customers of Griddy, and Griddy should not have tried to sign up those customers. I think that's absolutely true. I think it was unwise, right? Now, apparently they were, Griddy was intending this coming summer, unfortunately too late for them, to offer a partly hedged rate that I think would have been a really good experiment. So in some sense, it's kind of a pity that they didn't get to do that, because I think that would have been a really interesting experiment. That would have done the following. It would have hedged the retail customers against a typical daily load profile, but exposed them to real-time prices for deviations above and below. So what would that mean is if we had another extreme event, you might not be able to heat your house to 68, but you would have still been hedged to be able to consume some energy, right? That I think would have been a more likely to have survived such an event as this. Yeah.
And I would like to come back to that point of doing a little bit more refined load shedding. But before we get to my question, I'd like to give Paul a chance, who's been raising his hand. Paul?
Yes, hi. I wonder if you might like to comment on, well, I mean, I think everyone remembers that there were some rather acerbic comments from the governor of Texas and from various commentators like Tucker Carlson about the causes and so forth of the problems in Texas. I wonder if you might comment on care to comment on any of that.
Well, I think it's clear that wind was not sole to blame. There's a lot more wind than solar in Texas, so it's kind of the opposite of California, although solar is growing fast. We have about 25 gigawatts of wind, but as I said, it's not terribly windy in winter anyway, and so ERCOT was not relying on much wind. I think they were expecting 7 gigawatts of wind production during some of these days. It varies over time, of course, and in some cases it was a couple of gigawatts short. But a couple of gigawatts short is not the difference between us having blackouts, rolling blackouts or outages and not having them, right? So it was a small, not zero, but a small fraction of the whole thing. I think those sort of comments are more driven by a general animus towards renewables rather than a coherent assessment of what was going on. If I can put that charitably, That's as charitably as I can put it.
Very diplomatically said. So Ross, I would like to ask about the demand side, because it seems to me that the real tragedy here is not the fact that the grid was unable to meet the demand during an extreme event. The tragedy is that led to loss of life, and that people suffered beyond a minor inconvenience from the shortage.
I'm absolutely in agreement with you, Sasha, and I think there was, as has been widely reported, I think there was a significant failure to encourage those that had electricity to conserve, okay? So my own utility, which is Austin, my own supplier, which is Austin Energy, Texas has a mixture of retail competition. If you're in a particular place, you can sign up with Griddy or anybody, and geographical monopolies run by municipals and rural co-ops. I happen to be in Austin. I sometimes refer to it as the People's Republic of Austin. And Austin Energy is our monopoly supplier. And their what should I say? Their public service announcement was, don't put your thermostat above 68. Now, you know, that's just not conserving as far as I'm concerned, right? It's not, right? That's as warm as you'd ever want it, right? They eventually went down to 60. I think had they started at 60 and gone down to 50 for the consumers that were not blacked out, that would have left quite a few megawatts over to have allowed for rolling of the blackout. So there was a good question about what's an outage and what's a blackout. Let me distinguish when I'm deliberately switching a particular distribution line off in order to lower demand in a controlled manner. We could call that a controlled outage or a controlled blackout. And I want to distinguish that from an uncontrolled blackout, where let's say the frequency drops, generators trip off, and suddenly we have no power anywhere, okay? Which is not only uncontrolled, but leads to a widespread blackout. So the blackouts that we experienced, or the outages we experienced, were controlled in the sense that individual feeders were switched off so that demand did not exceed supply. But the remaining feeders, the ones that were on under frequency relays, the ones that were on critical loads on critical feeders, I think they could have done a much better job of saying, please conserve, we need to switch some other feeders back on to be able to give them a little bit of electricity, right? You've got electricity continuously, please conserve, okay? I think there are also some other technical possibilities for how to share that pain better, okay? For example, we could have sectionalization of distribution feeders, switches that can be remotely controlled. Not only that, in the competitive retail areas of Texas, every one of the meters can be remotely disconnected. They can be switched off. So in principle, we could have done rolling down to the individual customer level. Actually, we can't. Why can't we? Because the communication bandwidth is designed for a few tens of thousands of switching offs and switching ons a day, not for millions. But in principle, with some expansion of communications bandwidth, I mean, retrofitting that might be rather expensive, but in principle, you could do much more fine-grained control. Furthermore, you could, the broader issue of demand response, market participants who see high prices maybe are partly hedged so that they can get some electricity to survive, but see that the price is high, and by dipping their consumption a little bit compared to their forward contracting level, or otherwise seeing that there is a tight supply condition, could have also been beneficial. We have about 2 gigawatts of demand in ERCOT that palpably responds to price changes, okay? I think going forward, particularly as we go to much higher levels of renewables, we're going to need many, many more gigawatts of demand response. So I'm not talking about someone being switched off in an emergency situation. I'm talking about someone who can modulate their consumption. And I think that's going forward going to be the only viable way to get, well, there's going to be lots of things that will contribute to us getting very, very high levels of renewables. I think one essential thing is a greater amount of demand response, you know, along the lines of the LBL stuff that talks about, you know, shimmying and shifting and so forth, right? All of these things I think are going to be part and parcel of us getting to higher levels of renewables. And by the way, if you had that capability, it would have also helped with the blackout, right? It would have also helped with the blackout. we had a situation where downtown Austin, for various technical reasons, they couldn't black it out, but there were buildings that had their external lights on, right? There was no one downtown because everybody was closed. When there's ice and snow in Texas, no one goes out. It's too scary, right? But these places had their lights on. I understand that Austin Energy appealed to the building owners to switch off the lights, but you know, they weren't necessarily clued into how to do it. So I live about 2 kilometers from downtown, okay? When I trudged over to campus to charge my devices, the university has its own generator, you know, in the distance, I could see the lights on the hill of, of the downtown that was on, even though my neighborhood was blacked out. So.
Well, we're coming to probably should be coming to a close. I think there were 2 more hands raised, but they've been taken down. Let's take one last question from Will before we wrap up.
Well, I re-raised my hand, but I guess, so I wanted to re-ask what Duncan asked in the comments, but he had to leave. And you've talked a bunch about forward contracting. I'm wondering if you have any quantification of how hedged these markets are. So Duncan's question was about rent and for generators that were able to stay on, and presumably, you know, for most of those, they were all hedged. And so they didn't see a lot of rents themselves. But I think the matter of scale matters. You know, if 10% of those generators aren't hedged, like those have implications for market power and things like that. And so is there a good public source of how many of these forward
No, I don't think
exist?
there's good public information about this. It's by you know, it's private information between private individuals about their individual contracting. It's thought that a majority, and a significant majority, so this is 70 to 90% of all electricity in ERCOT is forward contracted. Okay, that would be I think a commonly accepted number. Now, the trick is you might be well hedged for normal things, normal bad things going on, let me say, right? You might have forced outage insurance, you might have this, you might have that. But this was so extended, and because the demand side was so significantly interrupted, there are retailers like Austin Energy who have made a big profit. Okay, there are other retailers, Brazos Electric, which is a rural cooperative, that has declared bankruptcy. So even though you might find that the industry as a whole looks pretty comfortably off, but individual actors are going to be in quite adverse conditions or in quite good conditions, right? And I think that's the contracting is private. These are private agreements. ERCOT has some information about quantities that are agreed on as contracts, but doesn't know the prices behind them. And it may not know all of the quantity information either. One way to think about this is when people start saying, oh, I'm really bad off because of the blackout, you really can't answer that question until they reveal all of the private information about their hedging, right? And I would challenge anybody who's claimed to have lost a lot of money. They make that claim in public, one should counterclaim them and say, okay, you have to tell me every one of your forward contracting arrangements and make them public as well. And then we'll add it up and figure out whether or not you lost money, right? The point being, what you hear in public is people complaining that they've lost money, right? You're not going to hear in public someone complaining that they made out like a bandit, right? Okay. And so it's hard, it's very hard to get good information about this, at least from a public academic perspective, right? There may be parties such as Intercontinental Exchange, which trades electricity, that has more detailed information, as to whether or not they're ever going to, I mean, they're probably bound not to reveal that information, but they may be a private party that could help with understanding that. You know, there's no doubt there's already lawsuits going on, and there's enough $1 billion when you multiply 20 gigawatts of curtailment times $9,000 per megawatt hour times 60 hours, you get up to 5 billion very easily. And at times there was probably more than 20 gigawatts and it lasted for more than 60 hours. So, you know, there's a lot of money sloshing around, and to hammer down all of it is difficult, right? It's difficult.
That might be a great note on which to close. Thank you so much, Ross. And back to Keith for the last word. Thank you for organizing this.
Keith?
Sorry about that. So I am putting a link in the chat right now, bottom link, not the top one. If anyone hasn't had the chance, or anyone who hasn't left yet has a chance to fill that out, we'll be sending out, well, that'll give you a raffle ticket basically for the end of the term raffle, chance to win an Amazon gift card or some other prize. So please fill that out if you haven't left yet. And thank you so much, Ross. That was a wonderful kickoff talk. And I certainly got a number of things out of it. So yeah, I'll be more informed when people ask me about the Texas Blackouts now, that's for sure. I've been telling them they just needed more asynchronous connections with the Eastern and Western grids. Your point about the surrounding blackouts was subtle, but important as well. Anyways, I think everyone really appreciated that. And thank you so much, Ross.
It's my pleasure. It really is. Thank you. Good to see all old friends. Hopefully one day I might be able to see a few of you in person once more, huh? Well, very good, yes.
Ross, we would love to host you in person for one of these talks once things go back to normal.
I'd be absolutely delighted. Okay, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.